Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. And thank you for joining us today to this event brought to you by Casablanca Finanace City. Today is a big day. It's Africa Day. And we're so glad to be back in this beautiful new setting to honor and celebrate Africa together. Today is about the Africa we want, the Africa we believe in. We are coming together as one community to share real experiences and let everyone see that the change is on. So without further ado, and to kick off this celebration, it's my privilege to introduce to you Mr. Saïd Ibrahimi, CEO of Casablanca Finanace City, for his welcome note.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. On this day, 58 years ago, the Organization of African Unity, now known as the African Union, was born. Since its inception, it held the idea that only through unity and regional integration could Africa unlock its full potential. Today, we pay tribute to all those who fought for the economic and political integration of our continent. As we mark this Africa Day, once again in the shadow of the coronavirus pandemic, we also hold on to the promise of a brighter future. Narratives over the past few decades have painted a wide range of negative views on Africa. Poor development, political unrest, poverty, forced migration, and diseases. The truth is, as always, more nuanced. And while recognizing undeniable progress does not lift our responsibility from working on some realities, one thing is certain. The transformation that Africa has undergone in recent decades has been remarkable. Africa is shaping its own destiny and should be referred to as the African opportunity instead of the African threat. At Casablanca Finanace City, we want to play our part in changing the narrative. We are proud to bring together 200 African believers, and we want more people and investors to see and believe that the change is on. We need to move faster and at scale. I would like to express a heartfelt thank you to the wonderful lineup of speakers who accepted our invitation today, and extend our congratulations for a happy Africa Day to all CFC members and fellow Africans. Have a great day.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ibrahimi. Indeed, Africa's image in the world is mainly seen through a distorted lens of misconceptions. It would greatly benefit from an updated narrative and some good PR. Today, with our guests, we want to describe the extent of the African business opportunities in three key sectors. We'll do that in three parts: infrastructure, digital transformation, and financing. For our first conversation on infrastructure, I'm excited to start off with three experts and on the topic and members from the CFC community. Mr. Philippe Miquel, CEO of Engie North Africa. Hello.
Hello.
Mr. Raza Hasnani, Managing Director, Head of Infrastructure Investments at Africa 50.
Hi.
Mr. Mohammed, Rachid, Director of Financial Sector and Institutional Affairs at Casablanca Finanace City.
Good morning.
Welcome to you all, and many thanks indeed for your time. Before we dive in, let's watch this short video and be right back.
In all economies of the world, infrastructure is the key to prosperity and progress. Therefore, investment in infrastructure is crucial to boost the continent's economic growth. Africa continues to suffer from an infrastructure deficit, which makes it a breeding ground for investments. The need for infrastructure funding in Africa is estimated at $130 to $170 billion a year in many sectors, such as renewables, ICT, transportation. It is especially important now, given the entry into force of the Continental Free Trade Area. In Africa, the infrastructure financing gap is estimated to be $108 billion a year, but significant progress has been made. Since 2000, annual investment in infrastructure has doubled to around $80 billion a year. Institutions such as Africa 50, an infrastructure investment platform established by African governments and the African Development Bank, plays a major role in providing support to investors at every stage of the project, accelerating the delivery while mitigating risks and seeking reasonable return on investment. Many developers are leading the way, such as Engie Africa, a long-term partner for Africa's growing energy needs. The continent's potential is vast, and Casablanca Finanace City is committed to supporting its community in grasping this potential and closing the financing gap.
Let me start with you, Mr. Hasnani. You have over 23 years of infrastructure, private equity, and impact investing experience in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. You started your career at Deloitte in Philadelphia, then you moved to Dallas and Houston, where you led energy and infrastructure projects around the world while at ExxonMobil Corporation. Here you are now, living in the capital city of Morocco, where you lead the infrastructure investments business at Africa 50, which, by the way, we're very proud to have as a member of our CFC community. Thank you so much for joining us. So, my first question, as we just saw in the video, before COVID, the financing gap was already estimated above $100 billion annually. And now the gap is even bigger due to foreign capital flight. How do we bridge that gap?
Thank you. Let me start by first thanking you for inviting me to this distinguished panel, and to CFC for hosting this important discussion on Africa Day. Infrastructure is definitely one of Africa's most pressing needs, and this is true now more than ever as we recover from the COVID pandemic and build back more resilient societies. In fact, at Africa 50, we think that infrastructure should be a key component of any post-pandemic recovery program. As you mentioned, the financing gap is still huge, but that is also a great investment opportunity. Indeed, given the limited resources of governments, attracting private sector capital is key to bridging the gap. And this is our mandate at Africa 50. We are an investment platform that was created by African governments and by African central banks, including the African Development Bank, to accelerate the delivery of sustainable infrastructure on the continent. We invest equity into projects. We leverage our capital to bring in other investors from the private sector, as well as debt funding from financial institutions. So we have two business lines which work together to bridge the funding gap. PD, which is project development, helps develop projects, and project finance, the business that I lead, acts as a private equity firm embedded within Africa 50 and invests in projects at financial close, into platforms, and provides growth capital. Now, in our view, it is a bit of a myth when people say that there's not enough financing available for projects. There is actually always enough financing available for well-developed projects. The problem is that there is a lack of well-developed projects, and Africa 50 is purpose-built to solve that problem. Investors will come if there's a reasonable return with a reasonable risk within a reasonable amount of time. If they have to deal with risks they cannot control or mitigate, or if they have to tie up their capital for a long period of time without progress, then that'll scare away capital. The issues are at the early stage. So when you talk about funding or bridging the infrastructure gap, the focus has to be on the early stage. McKinsey estimates that 80% of infrastructure projects in Africa fail in the development stage, and only 10% reach financial close. It is also found that in the 6th largest infrastructure markets in Africa, the cost of the feasibility study phase alone is about $30 billion. So Africa 50 contributes to the continent's inclusive growth through private and PPP investments in infrastructure. We bring together project development and project finance under one entity. So we function like a one-stop shop with the ability to deploy capital throughout the life cycle of a project.
Thank you so much for that. I have a second question for you. How could we leverage more domestic resources for Africa?
That's a very good question, because there is a very large and growing base of domestic investors in Africa. This includes regional banks, including the Moroccan banks. There are quite a few domestic private equity funds. And in fact, in our view, Infrastructure in Africa and in emerging markets in general actually has quite a few of the characteristics of private equity. So if there are well-developed projects available, if there are good opportunities available, that will induce private equity firms to invest in infrastructure. Then another major source are African institutional investors. Pre-COVID, the estimate was that the assets under management of African institutional investors would rise to almost $1.8 trillion by the end of 2020. Then there are about 400 African companies with revenues of over $1 billion a year. Then there are African sovereign wealth funds, which are also rapidly growing, and many, many countries have them. So the capital is out there looking for bankable opportunities. But the solution to bringing in this domestic capital is about the same as the solution to bringing in international capital. Domestic investors in Africa are very sophisticated, if not more sophisticated, they're as sophisticated as international investors. And they have an added advantage of having a very good on-the-ground understanding of the risk. So if they have the ability to invest in projects that are well prepared, where the risks and returns are allocated properly, there will be a rush to invest in those projects.
Thank you so much. I'd love to hear about the opportunities, but before we do so, I'd like to turn to you, Mr. Philippe Miquel. You also have an extensive business experience here in Africa. Before you moved to Morocco in March 2019 as CEO of Engie North Africa, you held several leadership positions in Yaoundé, Cameroon, and Abidjan, Ivory Coast. Engie, as we know, is the largest independent electricity producer in the world. We are neighbors at the CFC Tower, actually. Obviously, very proud to have you as a member of our business community as well. Do you have any reaction on what has been said right now?
Sure. Thank you indeed for having us. I think it's an important topic that we're addressing today. When you look at the numbers, indeed, that looks gigantic, 100 billion per year to bridge the gap. Post-COVID, it's going to be extremely complicated. But I think it's actually an opportunity to turn into the solutions of tomorrow on the one hand, and the solutions dedicated or applied to Africa on the other. If we look at the energy space where Engie is operating in Africa and elsewhere in 70 countries in the world, the world of energy is going through a significant transition. We were used to building large power plants that were feeding a network that was supplying customers. That system is going backwards. Our customers are today becoming producers of their own production, of their own needs. Through rooftop solar, through the reuse of their waste into biogas with the battery of their cars where they don't use their cars, through zero energy buildings. That world is the world of tomorrow. Google in the US has put an offer where you can buy the energy of the car of your neighbor. And we very much believe that the world of tomorrow in the energy space is the world of sharing energy among users. And so we move away from that very centralized world. And that very centralized world is quite costly, actually, hence the part of that 100 billion. How does that translate for Africa? Where currently, Engie in Africa is servicing about 4 million people with what we call solar home systems. It's a small solar panel with a battery with appliances connected to it. And that's the African translation of the world that I just described. And it's much less costly for Africa to develop through that route than through a very centralized system with large power plant networks supplying customers. We looked at those figures, connecting one house to the grid, which is far into the African surroundings, cost about 4,000 euros to connect one house. A solar home system is between 250 to 400 euros, a factor of 10. And so one way to bridge the gap that we mentioned is to apply those models to Africa. And that is made possible by what you mentioned in the short movie that we've seen, the development of renewable energy. It's also made possible by the development of digital tools that will be part of a panel later today. And so if we do that, combined, we'll still need large power infrastructure. But combining those infrastructures with solutions that are applied and dedicated to Africa is, to me, one way to quickly bridge that gap and accelerate that past the COVID era.
That's a very interesting perspective from a developer's point of view on how to bridge that financing gap. Now, as we know, Engie has over 50 years of experience on the continent. And we're talking today to potential investors who are looking to invest in Africa. What's your feedback on the business environment in Africa? How did you make it work?
Well, it's indeed, we've been present in over 50 years. We're operating in three spaces. The first one is a large power infrastructure in the renewable space, which is our strategy going forward. We are also operating in the field that I just described, what we call energy access, supplying solar home systems, mini-grid based on renewable to individual. And we're also operating in the space of energy servicing, making sure that our customers are using energy the most efficient, through the most efficient way as possible. Our experience in Africa has always been extremely positive, despite indeed some drawbacks. There's a lot of needs, for sure. As I mentioned, that there was a lot of people willing to invest. That is true. There are also a lot of people willing to finance a project, yet we see very not enough kilowatt hours that are being produced on a daily basis. But the needs are there, the capabilities are there for sure. The people wanting to develop and finance are also knocking on the door on a daily basis. And everything we've done in Africa has always translated, in terms of our assets, has always translated into project on time, on budget, and in terms of performance at the expected performance level. And the reason for that is because, again, of the capabilities that you find in Africa, the fact that we've always been locally grounded, and that helps tremendously, and also the fact that we have applied the technology, the way we do business in the 70 countries where we operate to Africa. So we've brought that knowledge, and as a result or as a feedback, we've been extremely successful in terms of the quality of our operation in Africa. And so for us, it remains a significant territory for investment, particularly in the space of energy, where the needs are extremely significant.
Well, that's brilliant. I mean, projects on time, on budget, on the expected performance level, that certainly can help change some perceptions. Thank you so much for your insight. I'm moving to you, Mohammed. You are Director of Financial Sector and Institutional Affairs at Casablanca Finanace City, also member of the Executive Committee. CFC is an African financial center committed to the continent's future and also a business partner to over 200 companies operating in 50 countries in Africa, helping them unlock that potential. So it has been mentioned earlier by Mr. Ibrahimi in his welcome note that Africa's narrative has been tainted by all sorts of misconceptions. As we are speaking to potential investors right now, what are these main misconceptions? How could we unpack those?
Thank you, Manal. It's a very good question. It reminds me when the Economics magazine declared in 2000 that Africa is hopeless, and then in 2011 as arising, and then in 2013 as aspiring. With all the progress that has been made in recent years in the perspective of the African Continental Free Trade Agreements, which will be the largest in the globe by the 2050. I think that Africa has a strong fundamentals to be the next investment and business destination, but unfortunately investors still hold a bunch of misconceptions. And first and foremost, the common mistake made by investors is to view Africa as a country, not as a continent with 54 countries with different laws, rules, regulations related to trade and investment, with different risk profiles, with different comparative advantages, and this is a real misconception. The second one is that Africa is risky. I think that it's all about risk management, because Africa is very well rewarded as risk takers at higher returns. Today, investors have a range of risk mitigating instruments, risk mitigating products from the IBRD, from the IFC, from the MIGA, multilateral investment guarantees. And that's very very important to use them when appropriate and where appropriate. Also, today, investors have good risk assessment tools. I mean, to disaggregate risks specific to sectors and specific to the different countries. And that last but not least, one strategy to mitigate the investment in Africa is to use a good entry point. And this is the role of CFC. A good entry point to operate from a vibrant ecosystem like ours. It offers attractive doing business, it offers significant incentives, and it helps remove some of the barriers. A third misconception is about poor infrastructure. I think that significant progress has been made in recent years, and Africa is moving to close this infrastructure gap. The fourth misconception is about insecurity. But you have just to have a look to the global peace index of the Economist magazine, and you will see that a lot of countries are peaceful and have been peaceful for a long decade without any other problem. The last misconception is about poor business environment. And it's not the truth. I mean, the ease of doing business has extremely improved in Africa, and at the extent that many countries like Morocco, Rwanda, Kenya outperform some of the countries like Brazil, Russia, and India. And remember that these countries was considered like as a heaven or a good, attractive destination for investment, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, because it was the restricted, limited group of BRICS. There are some misconceptions about investment in Africa. I think that identifying them helps us to break them. But honestly, for sure, the best move to take to cap the potential or the full potential for Africa is to operate from Africa, because the total mix of information is, about an investment is significantly altered when you are not in Africa.
Thank you so much, Mohammed Rachid, for those insights. I mean, definitely there are some realities, but that will help our audience go check up and look up all these facts. So before we wrap up this session, I'd like to have one final word on the opportunities. So going back to you, Mr. Raza Hasnani, what are the opportunities? How do you see infrastructure investment looking forward?
Yeah, so for us at Africa 50, it is self-evident that Africa is the land of opportunity. And there are many good investment prospects. This is all driven by the factors that the other panelists talked about, the secular growth, the rising disposable incomes, the growing middle class, which creates a very, very strong foundation for investment prospects on the continent. So we see opportunities in the traditional sectors, such as energy and transport, but also to sectors that are emerging and have actually gained urgency, such as information and communications technology, healthcare, financial technology infrastructure, and education. For example, let's take health infrastructure. Traditionally, this has been the domain of public sector, but it is becoming more attractive for private capital. The middle classes are growing and becoming more health conscious and have increased purchasing power and access to healthcare. And many, many healthcare investments have the nature of infrastructure. Meanwhile, ICT, information and communications technology, I don't think anybody needs to be convinced anymore on how critical it is to our lives now. It has become obviously a very, very commercially viable sector, and it will need many, many billions over the next decade to connect all Africans, with a third of it in infrastructure. At Africa 50, we look at ICT infrastructure across 3 verticals. This includes fiber and broadband, data centers, and then telecom towers. And all 3 are very attractive sectors. There is a lot of international and local capital coming in, which is a good news for the African consumer, because when a lot of capital is chasing projects, the cost of capital goes down, and very, very importantly, the prices paid by the ultimate customers go down. Power generation has been taking off for several years, including IPPs, and Africa's ample renewable and hydrocarbon resources is going to make this a very, very attractive sector. And finally, infrastructure opportunities will grow further with the implementation of the African continental free trade area, which will create larger markets and economies of scale for investors.
Thank you so much. A lot of opportunities for you to go check out there. ICT, definitely. We have a full section dedicated to that in just a couple of minutes. Mr. Philippe Miquel, on your side, what would be one word you would address to potential investors, and how do you see the opportunities moving forward?
I think in the space of energy, in the space of infrastructure, as I said earlier, there's a lot of needs, and that comes with a lot of opportunity. As far as we are concerned at Engie, one example that I'd like to take in the space of renewable energy, which is, by the way, one way for Africa to gain its independence in its energy supply. There's a lot of wind in Africa, and there's a lot of sun in the region. One country is a good example of that. Senegal had about 800 megawatt of installed capacity up until 2018. Most of it was based on fossil fuel. Today, it's about 1,400, and the gap has been bridged by renewable energy. We are developing 2 renewable solar PV plant where the lowest cost in Western Africa, when we developed the project, we are nearing completion. It's 25 and 35 megawatt of solar PV in Senegal that will supply about 530,000 people. That will help avoid about 89,000 tons of CO2 that will be avoided. And Senegal, like many other African countries, have bet on renewable, focused on renewable energy going forward. It is today both the most climate compatible technology, and it's in terms of full cost, the lower cost technology to produce power. Both solar and wind are the lowest cost technology to supply power. So that comes also with the ability to regain or gain financial efficiency for countries of Africa.